Hey everyone, Anark here, and this is another episode of the series that I'm doing called Anark Responds. And in this series, what I do is I go through the comments sections of the YouTube videos that I've done, and I respond to them here for everyone to see. The video that I've chosen today is the fourth part of my series, The State is Counter-Revolutionary. And this part is actually focusing on the sort of theory of the state. And you might say it is an extensive critique of the authoritarian left conception of how the state is intended to be used in order to achieve socialism, or I suppose in a longer term sense, communism. This video has a lot of comments, of course, from angry authoritarian leftists. So if that sounds interesting to you, stick around because that's what we're going to be talking about today. So here's the first one that I have. And this first one is from the user Lily Kwan. Lily Kwan points out, it's interesting that Marx was willing to learn and change from the failure of the Paris Commune, but MLs refused to learn and change from the numerous mistakes of the 20th century. And yeah, that is in a large part what I was pointing out in this video series. Is if we were actually trying to judge the success of these projects on their ability to attain worker control, to move towards a state of existence where there was no longer commodity production and, the wage labor relation was abolished and the means of production were not held in the hands of a narrow few, but were instead socialized to be held in the hands of the masses, specifically the proletarian in the Marxist conception, then they were an abject failure on that front. All of them produced capitalism. But unlike the socialists or the communists of the time of the Paris Commune, who looked at the failures of the Paris Commune and sort of adjusted their conceptions of how things worked, authoritarian leftists really just doubled, tripled, and quadrupled down on the method that led to state capitalism and the destruction of socialism. And that's really what this video series was pointing out. Somebody afterwards responds to this user and says something like, what do you think that their response to the Paris Commune was? And I recalled when looking at that comment that for some reason the authoritarian leftists have told this myth that after the Paris Commune, Marx became more authoritarian. But that's just utterly false. Both Marx and Engels, in fact, became more anti-authoritarian after the Paris Commune. Both of them beforehand believed in some form of sort of social democracy. They believed in a form of sort of like electoral insurgency into parliaments in order to create a socialist majority, which could then undergo transformation in that sense, or at least could create a state that was sympathetic to the ends of the workers. However, the Paris Commune instilled within them the understanding that you could actually create a sort of prefigurative worker state, which could act as an insurgent force outside of the state, that could create a replacement worker power structure, and that worker power structure could serve to, countervail the state. And so their takeaway was actually that it made them more revolutionary, and it made them believe more in the ability of the workers from the bottom up to create an alternative structure that could destroy the previous one. So it is odd to me that the authoritarians have spread this myth that Marx and Engels became more authoritarian after the Paris Commune. It's just absolutely not true. In fact, Engels began to distance himself from even using the word state in the context of a worker's state afterwards. We have a personal letter between Engels and I believe it's Babel, where he says that they should abandon the word state and begin calling it the commune after the Paris Commune. So yeah, no, it's interesting how their forerunners could radically reconceive their notions of praxis, but authoritarian leftists just double down on the praxis that got us state capitalism. So yes, absolutely agreed. So there are a lot of long comments like this on the video. I'm going to have a hard time kind of fitting them on screen, and I think it's probably going to be hard for y'all to even see some of these comments. There we go. Okay. Okay. So I'm doing the technologies. There we go. So the comments from Casper Timor, I think is how you would say that. And the comment is, nice video. A curious thing is that as a third world anarchist, I always found American and sometimes European MLs to be kind of weird. There are MLs in my own country that I disagree with, but I can still take seriously. But American MLs are just fucking insane, their wording. They all seem like cult brainwashed people, impossible to talk to and repeating cliches ad nauseum. I had Americans online try to lecture me about how anarchism is a first world thing and all work on the third world is done by MLs, which just no. Most of the left here is reformist. MLs are a concentrated presence, basically on the same level as anarchism still is. Some of these long comments I'll probably be kind of like responding to in chunks. Damn, camera, come on, focus. Oh, I see why it is. All right, well, the bad news is I guess the camera's not going to focus on me. But yeah, I'll have to respond to this kind of in chunks, as I will with several of these longer comments. This first one is absolutely true. In fact, I talked to people that are not from the United States and Europe who are authoritarian leftists, and they typically seem a lot more coherent. I'm not going to say that they are like automatically going to be some form of allies, but at least what they're saying makes a little more sense. They're more ready to accept, for example, that these states they've created are state capitalist or even capitalist. They may have a tendency to sort of redefine communism in a rather absurd way, where communism just means trying to do a communism and that's it. But they generally have a much better grasp of theory, and they don't function as much like a cult, but instead like just kind of like another political tendency. Not one I agree with, but not nearly as much like a sort of weird decentralized cult. And what this person is saying is absolutely true in my experience as well. Basically, they just kind of repeat a series of talking points. One of those talking points is that anarchism has no presence in the third world. And of course, this is just a product of ignorance. Anarchism is in fact very popular in the third world and has been for a very long time. In fact, it has had an enormous presence in countries in Central and South America, as I've said other times on this channel, but also in places like China, where the Maoist revolution took place, places like Russia, where the USSR was created, and at the time the USSR was created. Now, I wouldn't say that anarchists were the majority presence in either of these, but there was a significant presence of anarchists in each of these. They're just completely erased when authoritarian leftists come in the room. They just pretend that those don't exist and that those didn't happen and that there were no anarchists. And next is, they say, one thing I think contributes, not always, but frequently to this mentality is lack of vision or a feeling of impotence. We are used to seeing history and politics presented as a big stage where notorious and powerful figures make big decisions and movements backed by positions of power. And it is very easy to be stuck in this mentality, specifically without learning about praxis in a libertarian socialist view. So I believe someone not so directly implicated in bigger struggles, so someone in the first world or middle class people, lacking a view about how they can contribute as mere individuals, may attach themselves to the idea of state power as a saving grace, and the ideas of powerful peoples and nations being on their side, quote unquote, in many instances, evolving into a cult of personality or of big, strong men, like a Cold War mentality, but on a left-wing viewpoint. Many a cult of power is fueled by feelings of impotence. I just want to say that this matches my own conception so close that it is almost exactly things I've said before. I think that the authoritarian impulse, the tendency of wanting to follow a strong man, this belief in a central state government, of having a leader that tells you what to do and all of this, I think that this primarily roots from a feeling of powerlessness or impotence, as has been said here. Because here's the thing. If you believe you don't have any power, and you believe that all of those that you are able to organize with, or the masses of people, are also powerless, then what you're going to do is you're going to look for something that brings you comfort, that eliminates that feeling of impotence. That is a very difficult feeling to live with. The feeling of powerlessness is a very disturbing feeling, okay? And so the state is very powerful. And if you can convince yourself that that state somehow has your interests in mind, and that all you have to do in order to have your interests represented and carried out by this extremely powerful institution is to align yourself with that institution, it begins to make you think that you are powerful. And you begin to see yourself as an agent that is pushing that system and is going to benefit from the empowerment of that system. And you begin to think that it's like you begin to equate yourself to that system or to that figure. Not like even necessarily that you believe you're going to become that figure, but that it is like a representation of yourself. And when it does things, that's you doing things. And of course, I think that when you're in, these Western countries, when you're in the United States, when you're in Europe, and you're not living under one of these, state capitalist power structures, or really just, capitalist power structures painted red. Your only feeling of respite is that far away, there is some power structure that is carrying out the right line. And all you have to do is align yourself with it, and you will no longer be powerless. But what it ends up doing then is acting as a placating factor. It convinces you don't need to do anything. The only thing you need to do is convince more people that they should support that structure. Your entire world just becomes predicated around this weird social club thing where you're just creating this little tiny insular in-group, and all of you are sort of telling each other that you are powerful because you're associated with this distant power, that it has nothing to do with you, that doesn't care about you, but that makes you feel powerful, that eliminates your feelings of impotence. And I think this is a huge driving factor to how authoritarianism works in a variety of senses. But I think that it directly contributes to what you see in this weird cult-like mentality that seems to arise with a lot of authoritarian left tendencies, Stalinists, Maoists, Trotskyists, etc. Their whole world becomes predicated around propagandizing for that state structure that makes them not feel impotent anymore. So we'll read the last part of this. Also, American MLs seem very condescending from the outside, like self-appointed spokespeople for the peoples of the third world, but with no interest in engaging with their reality. I see a lot of dangists representing the Chinese people as an idealized working people, totally aligned with their government, which is just not true. They're workers like any others, working under conditions unfavorable to them and facing political repression. How many dangists will show international solidarity for Chinese workers defying the government and organizing against Apple, Foxconn? The bottom line is, as I will support American workers organizing against Amazon, I will support Chinese workers organizing against Apple, Foxconn. Socialism does not owe loyalty to any government, but only to the working class. See, I just agree with this 100%. I agree with this 100%. And, this kind of goes in line with what I was saying there. And it also notes something else, which is this, like this person says, like they've become representatives of the third world, like they get to bear the both like this sort of like martyr's cloak, like they are the oppressed third world because they identify with the governments of the third world, and they sort of weaponize it. They weaponize this conception that, they're connected with those people's struggle and they're fighting valiantly to represent them. And to the degree where they sort of just like cynically begin to weaponize the identities of those people, that they turn them into a bludgeon. They don't really care about the struggles of those people. They just care about using them as a bludgeon to push their ideology. And they because it's back to this feeling of impotence that they're trying to veil with their alignment with these governments, they are extremely condescending. They try to steamroll anybody who disagrees with them by weaponizing the identities of people whom they have absolutely no affiliation with, who have literally no idea who they are, and would probably shit talk them if they did. And for that reason, they actually end up not helping a workers' revolution, not making themselves or their class more powerful, but instead helping the people within those states who are repressing the workers and disallowing them from creating anything approximating a workers' revolution. Once again, one of the many reasons why I say that the state is counter-revolutionary. So on to the next comment. So this one is from Valerie Thistlewind. This person commented last time, I believe. They say, made it to the finish line. So now I would like to say again, thank you for making such digestible content. As a baby anarchist, it's all too easy to be overwhelmed by leftism and all of its facets, trying to figure out where the truth is. I think a big part of this is the simplistic mindset that authoritarianism instills into us, this good guy versus bad guy narrative. There must always be a villain, and with that, heroes. Individuals on the stage, not ourselves as a collective. Yeah, notice a commonality here between this and the last comment. And this breeds the ideas of state-induced socialism, in quotation marks, their defense of existence being that of protection against the bad guys. It's ironic how fascism and state socialism both use the past to reinforce their claims to oppression. While one uses it as a goal, the other uses it as a deterrent. You must listen to us and compromise, else we'll return to the old ways. We're the only ones standing between you and capitalism. So, yeah, they go on, they just kind of say some comments here. But I think one of the reason I included this one here is I just wanted to re-emphasize this idea, because this is going to pop up in a few comments here. This idea of defense, protection against the bad guys. This is a central narrative of the state. One of the main things that the state uses is this idea that it is defending the people from incursion. Of course, this neglects to mention the fact that the state is itself an oppressive force against the very people it is supposedly defending. The only reason the state defends you is the same reason why a bully might defend you against another bully, because you are their host. They're like a parasite to you. They extract everything from you. They can't have another bully coming in and extracting that misery from you. That's what they use to become powerful, to stay powerful. They have to defend you from another state because they are exploiting you. You are their host to exploit. If another state comes in and exploits you, then they can't exploit you. They're not doing it out of the kindness of their hearts. They're not doing it because they care about some struggle you're engaged in. They don't care about your struggle. They don't care. They care about keeping you as a reliable host they can continue to extract power from. So they're always going to give you this idea that they are the good guys and they're protecting you from the bad guys. This is part of the fundamental mythology of the state, that it is a defensive body. It is not, except for that it wants to defend itself. It wants to defend its own relations of exploitation so that it can continue exploiting you. So here we are, another comment by Lucky Black Cat, which once again, I've included these mostly to plug Lucky Black Cat because I know her channel is not growing as fast as it should be. So go over to Lucky Black Cat, subscribe to her channel. She does good work. She says here, finally watched this. Great job. Have you thought of trying to find a publisher to make this series into a book? I have not made any earnest efforts to do so. The whole thing is published together as one big piece called The State is Counter-Revolutionary on the Anarchist Library, but I would 100% be willing to work with a publisher to create a published form of this book. I would even be willing to expand the examples that are given as per what was discussed in some of the previous parts. You know, perhaps examples such as Chile, examples such as Yugoslavia might be good, examples such as Sweden or Cuba. Those might be the sorts of examples I would include if this series were to ever be turned into a book. So at ASB2392, that is quite a username, says, just finished this series. Really thorough and helped articulate a lot of things that I was thinking, particularly like the idea that the quote-unquote socialist revolutions of the 20th century were bourgeois. At their best, I think these revolutions have created social democratic societies that are highly controlled, but they've never gone further than that. Yeah, I'll just say to begin with, I agree with this entirely. I characterize the Bolshevik and the Maoist revolutions as bourgeois revolutions. I think that's all they really did is they carried out capitalist production. They transitioned from feudal conditions to capitalist conditions, you know, proto-capitalist perhaps conditions to full capitalist conditions. And all they did was they painted these transitions from feudal conditions to, or colonial conditions, as sometimes may be the case, to capitalist conditions. They painted them as being socialist transitions, but all they really did was create capitalist societies, and in the best cases, social democratic societies. So yes, I agree with this characterization entirely. The second thing they say is, and the kernels of hope that may exist in places like Cuba or Venezuela lie in their directly democratic features, like the commune movement in Venezuela or the directly democratic voting system in Cuba. However, their progress is also hampered by the state they exist under. Yeah, those examples are relatively minor when I've looked into them. That's not to demean, of course, the commune movement in Venezuela, or you know, insurgent movements in Cuba, but it should just be said that the state has not really been a force of encouragement for those things. The state has mostly been an impediment to the establishment of those things. So this one is from Jessica Black, 9852. She says, this series hardened my resolve. I hope you know how good and helpful this was to anybody that cares to learn, but especially to those of us that don't have people to bounce ideas off of to see if we're thinking clearly. Wow. Oh, wow. Thank you kindly. Yeah. So I just wanted to say, I'm glad that that's what this series did. It's sort of shocking to me that a text like this wasn't really written in the modern era. You know, we have kind of some similar things that were written during the rise of the USSR, but the real purpose of writing this was because I felt like there was sort of an absence of a text that did this very task, and hopefully helped people sort of orient themselves within a greater body of history and revolutionary theory to recognize how the authoritarian examples had failed so miserably, especially considering that they're constantly trying to claim that they are the movement that has such success. And what I really wanted to demonstrate is that they only really had success in creating capitalism. And this is just obligatory. I just had to include, you know, an Andrewism comment. Andrewism comments, I got to include it here. It's that simple. Andrewism says, let me pop my popcorn for this one. And there it is. That's it. That's it. Andrewism comments, I respond. Go follow Andrewism's channel. He's doing fantastic work over there. Another long one. So this person says, great series, watched all 4 parts. I think the root of the problem is the infantilization of adult humans, whether self-imposed, internalized by coercion from external sources, or enforced. Personal autonomy has to be accompanied by a sense of self-responsibility, and all institutions of power seek control by reassuring people that they can simply hand over the burden of responsibility. I think this person is very correct. I think that this is a big part of what's happening with the state. And it goes back to that what I was just saying a minute ago about feelings of impotence as well, people feeling powerless and the state assuring them that it will act as their representative representatives and therefore make them feel less powerless in the process. So they will happily get rid of that responsibility to act and to govern themselves together if the state assures them it will act in their stead. But of course, it never does. State doesn't act in the stead of the people and cannot. In the long run, once again, it can only exist to parasitize the power of the masses. It does not exist to act as our representative at any point. Never will, never has, never. It's impossible, just by a sheerly theoretic sense and by how power works. Just not possible. And therefore, as this person says, it has to infantilize the masses. It has to convince them that they have no power, that they can't have power, that they are not fit to govern themselves. They are not fit to have a society wherein they determine the flow of things, that they make decisions about how things function. It must fundamentally always infantilize the masses. So individual people need to build in themselves a willingness to react to the best of their ability when situations arise. Exactly. This is a big part of what anarchism attempts to do. Not for the benefit of production or ideologies, but as a foundational aspect of being. You see someone who needs help, you help. You recognize that a group lacks a resource that you have, you give your surplus. And you hold yourself accountable for your mistakes while never allowing your own personal autonomy to be compromised. No one needs to be forced to do what's right. They just have to understand why it's right and why it's important. Thanks for making these videos. I think this person definitely has a pretty solid understanding of the arguments of the anarchists here. I think, what you'll see here is some very recurring themes within anarchism. These are things that anarchists talk about a lot. I find it interesting that they use the terms responsibility here. And accountability. I think those are two very important words that we don't use enough to describe what's happening in these dynamics. We have responsibility to others, and we need to also be accountable to others. Yeah, this one's sort of a repeat of what I saw in one of the previous comments, but it's just true. It just bears repeating. Victor says, it's funny that MLs assume that the individual national vanguards will join together to form one global union, when in reality, they always ended fighting each other. Well, at least as much as capitalist nations did. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. At the very root of hierarchical power is competition. Because hierarchical power always seeks to utilize flows of power, once again, as in a parasitic sense, that it's treating these power flows like a host might treat them, not in a symbiotic sense, but in a parasitic or predatory sense. It will always see other structures, other power structures, other hierarchical structures as competitors, and it will always seek to stamp them out unless they can be subverted. They must either be made lesser to that power structure must have leverage over them, or they must be destroyed, and that hierarchical power structure seeks to expand its range of control. So that is why these state capitalist projects, these authoritarian left projects, always end up fighting with each other, because they actually still have the mentality of hierarchy. They are still competitors. They are still taking place in the age-old problems that go back to the age of feudalism, in the combat of different empires and the periods of warring states, and continued into the era of capitalism, with all of these different geopolitical blocs carrying out wars of imperialism as they do, and the state capitalists just participated in this age-old problem of hierarchy. And because they refuse to understand how hierarchical power structures work and to understand how power functions, they essentially just end up reproducing the old paradigm. And they can't act in a solidaric sense. They act instead in a competitive sense, reproducing the logic of capitalism really just so closely as to bear very little difference in their appearance and function. Here's another long one. This one is from to Baryon Tanuki. All right. So they say, great series. Thank you for your work. I'm not very educated, but would like to try and make a small contribution since it seems a lot of people, just like me, have some trouble reconciling the material progress achieved during past socialist experiments and the need to do a radical critique of them. Long story short, those were the achievements of the struggle of workers and peasants, not the achievement of the parties and their committees, just like the progress achieved in capitalism is the result of the workers' own struggle. So I'll comment on this one, paragraph by paragraph, because this one is somewhat long. First, I just want to say, because, I'm not reading ahead exactly here. I read this one earlier, but capitalism often produces an improvement in the metrics that are judged in the USSR and China as being metrics for improvement. Things like literacy rates. More people under capitalist nations are able to read and write than people in historic feudal nations. More people generally have access to healthcare or basic education. The exact metrics that people use in order to defend the USSR, those are the same sorts of metrics that capitalists use to defend capitalism. I mean, if you were to not have any sort of like profile pictures, or you couldn't see people's like profile descriptions, see they were called Marxist Leninist, or if they were just called like neoliberal capitalist, you'd find their arguments are extremely similar. The only real, as for the, progressivist or, progress that took place in places like the USSR and China. These are the same sorts of arguments that capitalists make for capitalism, right? This idea that, material conditions were improved, but of course they neglect to recognize that these material conditions came along with these, improvements in material conditions came along with extremely repressive regimes wherein people were also not allowed to take place in the commons, wherein their freedom was restricted, wherein they lived by way of wages that were doled out by capitalists and so on. There was an enormous trade-off. So it's not false to say that the USSR improved conditions over, a feudal czarist Russia. That's just, obviously true. But, the same thing could be said, when comparing, modern United Kingdom to the past, in a feudal existence or most other places, it's just kind of, you're just arguing for the benefits of proceeding from feudalism to capitalism. Okay. And maybe some of that progress was a little more evenly distributed within the USSR than if you were to compare it to a lot of, more traditional capitalist revolutionary changes. But ultimately, they are basically just the same changes. They're just distributed a little more quickly instead of having to be carried out through the slow process of private accumulation and distribution by way of taxation and social programs by the state. So that's all that's really going on here. They point out that, these were fought for by the workers. And yeah, I mean, that's true to some degree, but I would just note that these are the common handouts of any capitalist transition from feudalism or from, feudal conditions. So it's not to say that we have to deny they're true. We just have to note that these are typical qualities of a transition from that economic state of existence into the economic conditions of capitalism. Continuing on, they say, I like the parallel of the Mexican Revolution. We had a bourgeois revolution at the start of the XX century. There were more radical parties like the Zapatistas, but at the end, the liberal state waged war against any group opposing it and won. Then we got what in practice was a single party dictatorship for 90 years. And we also got nationalization, a welfare state. Marx was read in schools. It's no surprise progress happened. Not only the country went through some industrialization, but the revolution relied on the support of workers and peasants. And after the war, it would take time for a new ruling class to properly establish to establish itself. So repression and concessions were integral tools the state needed to maintain its rule. Now, just imagine the Mexican liberal pundits of today singing their praises to the revolution, presenting themselves as their ideological heirs while taking away the credit for what the workers created with their own hands and attributing their achievements to the country instead. Yeah, this person's hitting on something very, very accurate here, which is to say these transitions take place by the fights of the workers, not necessarily by way of the bureaucrats. They say, this all feels awfully similar to what happens in quote-unquote AES. Sure, the achievements of those MLM projects might have been bigger in scope, but also were just as antagonistic to the working class's ambitions to transform the relations of production. The difference being just its mediation tactics and the stage of class consciousness and the struggle of the people. So I don't see calling those projects a failure as an insult to the working people and their achievements. I see it as an insult. I see as an insult saying that a bunch of technocrats in their chairs defeated the Nazis and lifted millions out of poverty. Yeah, this is something I have had to say to a lot of authoritarian leftists. I find it extremely insulting to, venerate the great men of history, the Lenins and the Stalins and the Maos and the Trotskys and so on, instead of the workers. Stalin didn't fight the World War II and fight against the Nazis. It wasn't Stalin out on the front lines. It was millions of Russians, of the people that were doing those things. Stalin didn't do anything. Stalin was as all people at the top of a hierarchical power structure are. He was a parasite to the workers, to the masses of people who actually did the work to carry out the combat that took place in World War II. Stalin didn't sacrifice of himself in order to defeat the Nazis. The workers did. They lost their lives over it. And it's so insulting to me to venerate the great men for having done these things and not the people of Russia, not the people who actually went out and bled on the front lines, who sacrificed of themselves in both a revolutionary war and then a civil conflict and then a world war. Okay, yes, absolutely agreed. Extremely insulting that they take that line. I thoroughly dislike that that's how they try to portray these things. Coming back to that cult thinking we discussed a minute ago. Okay, so this person, their at is Marxist Gersmst Matskist full net thought. That's it. This is my best attempt. That's all you're getting. They say Lenin himself said the goal of socialism was communism. Communism is a classless, stateless, moneyless society where the means of production and distribution are commonly owned and controlled, and production and distribution are governed by the principle of from each according to their ability to each according to their need. Yes, that is absolutely exactly the definition of communism. They say, if your socialist project at any point stops pushing for that aim, I would argue that project has stopped being a socialist one. Yeah, I don't have that understanding of the word socialism, but I understand that perspective. And they say, and if the people have made pushes towards the goal and then your project reverses that movement, your project is definitely no longer socialist and has become reactionary and counter-revolutionary. Yes, absolutely. This person is essentially kind of in that last part there restating the thesis of these videos. There's precisely what I'm saying here. The states act as a force to react against socialism, not to implement it. They are, in fact, impediments to the success to move towards these goals of socialism and communism. This person, the Jovian 16, says, I'm so glad someone said what you did in the manner that you did. There are a bunch of Leninists on YouTube. I won't name names in case someone here decides to start harassing them, but I'm sure you know at least some of them. Yeah, no worries. At least one of them gets mentioned in these later comments. that insist that the USSR did good things, so it's above criticism, and their own admissions that it wasn't perfect and the Soviet government made mistakes is always cloaked in this, well, it's the best they could do under the circumstances, apologism. It's especially hilarious how they claim any serious criticism of the USSR is just capitalist indoctrination, while their commitment to the state is arguably an even bigger example of statist indoctrination. Yeah, I've always found the fact that they say these sorts of criticisms that I was offering in the statist counter-revolutionary or that anarchists offer are the product of capitalist brainwashing. And I always have to point out to them that it's literally the exact opposite. What the anarchists are proposing are criticisms that defend the revolutionary movement from the redefinition of our revolutionary goals as being capitalist. You know, essentially that we're trying to achieve state capitalism. Anarchists are the ones defending that. Whereas the United States government wholeheartedly agrees that the USSR was socialist or communist, or that China is communist. They're happy to call those places socialist or communist. Like China currently totally agrees with the U.S. government on how socialism or communism would be defined. They basically have the exact same conception. You know, the U.S. government and the USSR were happy to agree to call the USSR communist or socialist or whatever they wanted to call themselves, especially that because those were such poor examples of socialism or communism, the U.S. government recognized that it was actually helpful to call that state capitalism socialism, because nobody was going to fight a war to put that in place that was already living under capitalism. So in fact, if you call the USSR or China or Venezuela or Cuba or any of these places socialist or communist, you agree more with the capitalists. The capitalists are happy to call those places socialist or communist. The anarchists and the libertarian socialists are the ones that are trying to defend the actual goals of a revolutionary movement, which is to move towards worker control, which is to, as best as possible, eliminate the commodity form, which is to get rid of the state and its domination over the people, which is to get rid of classes, which is to get rid of all of these tools of repression which represent the capitalist order. Whereas if you're arguing that China or Venezuela or whatever, if any of these places are socialist or communist, you are aiding capitalism in recuperating those revolutionary goals, in trying to erase them from memory. You are aiding the enemy in erasing our historic revolutionary memory of the goals of what we were actually fighting for to begin with. So no, it is absolutely not capitalist brainwashing to remember the goals of the revolutionary movement. It is capitalist brainwashing to agree with literal capitalist nations and redefining socialism and communism to just mean when you want to do communism. Yeah, you know, it's socialism when your government says it wants to do a communism. That's it. That's all you got to do. Just say you want to do a communism and you're socialist. You know, or even better, you know, according to lots of apologists, if you want to do a communism, all you have to do is say you want to do a communism and you're communist. That's simple. That's it. That's it. That's all you got to do. Just say you want to do a communism. That's communist. Yeah, just absurd. These definitions, these sort of mealy-mouth reconceptions of our revolutionary goals are directly in aid to the capitalist order. They are redefinitions that only help the global imperial hegemon to reestablish itself everywhere, to recolonize every place where revolt was once happening. Neon says, bravo, this one episode of the series perfectly summarizes all my critique towards YouTubers like ya boy Hakeem. See, I told you he was gonna get a mention here. In his video called Why You Shouldn't Support Hong Kong Protests, of course, his argument was that since US supports them, you shouldn't. Yeah, this is like campism in a nutshell. Just this completely, there are only two sides to everything mentality. He says, oh, and because protesters used British and American flags, that was literally it. Not kidding. Go check it out yourself. I really hate this U.S. bad mentality around so many communist or socialist YouTubers. State is bad mentality, on the other hand. Yeah, no, we call this Campism. Okay. Campism is this belief. Oh, camera's out of, there we go. Campism is this idea that, there are only two geopolitical camps, and you just got to choose between them. Okay. So their conception is that it's basically the United States and all associated groups, or everyone else that is against them. And so what that means is, they essentially are just siding with a bunch of dictatorships. And this is just utter foolishness. This is childish. Sorry, I shouldn't say that, childishness is the worst thing to emulate here. This is unsophisticated, simplistic thinking. This is not nuanced thinking. This is not a revolutionary's way of looking at the world. There are not just two camps and you just choose a side. Okay, that's not how this works. There is, in fact, the workers in revolution attempting to liberate themselves in all of the countries of the world. Okay. And that is a movement we should support. And there is repression by the state and capital and forces of reaction. And we should always oppose those. Okay. I've always likened it in the way that I always argue against this is I say this would be like arguing in the age of feudalism that we had to choose sides between France and Great Britain, that oh yeah, truly a revolutionary ideology is just choosing the right side between two kings. That's all this is. This is just kind of like petty, single-minded, shallow conceptions of how politics work. This is a complete lack of understanding of how power functions. This idea that if there are two sides, there must be a good guy and a bad guy. And you'll notice that's been mentioned in numerous of these comments because that really is boiled down how most authoritarian leftists think about the world. And this is why we call them campists. Okay, this is the campist mentality. And it leads them to support pretty awful, despotic regimes on a regular basis because they think that the United States is the ultimate primeval evil of the world or primal evil of the world. That's what they really think is going on. It's incredibly simplistic. And, these generally you'll be able to spot a campist because they're never going to put campist in their description. You'll be able to spot them by the fact that they put anti-imperialist in their bio. And it's not to say, of course, it's bad to be an anti-imperialist. You should be, but they're not anti-imperialists most of the time. They're anti-U.S. imperialism. They don't really care about the imperialism of other nations. They don't care about imperialism as a process. They don't. That's not important to them. They only don't like a U.S. imperialism. And if you try to hold them to account on this, they'll just change the definition of imperialism. It's that absurd. They're sophists. They're like the Greek sophists. They're literally just using rhetoric to dance around reality, to avoid the reality that stands as it is. And instead of regarding that there are not just two political blocks, that there are in fact many, many competing states with their own interests that all have different power dynamics, that are all repressing and suppressing their own worker movements, that are all exploiting their own people. Instead, they just want to take sides. It's back to this thing again where they just want to get rid of their feelings of impotence. They want to take a side and think that they are fighting the glorious battle, and they're not. They're just siding with another repressive capitalist regime. Always, always. There's no counterexamples insofar as we're talking about campists, of course. Okay, next comment. This person's just okay, QG2ZD 2 months ago. They say, hey man, Replying in good faith here, I just want to thank you for this series. I still need to watch your Mao video, but this has been extremely educational. This is coming from someone who still has sympathies towards MLism, though you may find that distasteful. From now on, I will start absorbing your content, though I have let my biases get in the way in the past. However, I think you should maybe consider being more charitable to at least some modern MLs. Because personally, from perusing several ML and MLM channels, I have learned quite a bit about socialist history and strategy, though you may claim they misconstrue it, which could be correct. However, I think there needs to be more genuine discussion of disagreements between MLs and anarchists, which you might think there are too many differences between these groups, but it's worth the thought. Also, I think characterizing all of Lenin's work as having sucked, as you said in response to another comment, is probably at least kind of unfair. Anyway, I will try to study anarchism more thoroughly in the future. I feel I have misunderstood anarchism in the past because I had a Vosh obsession for a while, who I feel is an unproductive political commentator, though you may like him. Thanks and good luck in the future. Yeah, I don't really comment either way on Vosh because everybody gets very angry no matter what you say about him because everybody is very dug in and polarized. So no comment on that. Here's a lot of people have tried to convey to me that they think it is good to sort of, tell people that they should kind of be open-minded and consume authoritarian left material and try to take this sort of middle ground approach where they find the value in each. What I tell people is, it's probably not worth your time. Almost anything you could find in authoritarian left literature that you consider to be valuable can be found elsewhere in places that don't have all of these problematic assumptions. In the spirit of good faith, however, I will say what I think are works that I enjoyed by authoritarian leftists. One is, I think Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, has a lot of very good observations. I don't agree with his sort of narrow conception of imperialism, and I think that there are much better analyses of imperialism in a historic sense than that work. But I do think that work has a lot of good observations about how imperialism functions in capitalism. Okay, I think insofar as we're talking about how imperialism functions in capitalism, he is largely correct. I think that that's a pretty good description. Let's see what else. I think Mao's combat liberalism is also good. It's also good. It's unfortunate because I think I would like to recommend that to a variety of people I have met because it has a lot of good points that would probably be valuable for them to consider. But unfortunately, I don't really want to recommend people get into reading these authoritarian leftists because they're full of empty polemics, bad analysis, to be honest. I had to read a lot of these authoritarian leftists for this series and just as a general curious person. And I really don't think you're going to get much out of these texts. I don't. They're just really not that valuable. They are only valuable by comparison to ideologies that aren't trying to help you at all. Like, obviously you're not going to read Capitalists to learn how to do a revolution, and it would be better to read an authoritarian left text in order to learn how to do that than to read Capitalist Apologia. But if you want to learn how to do revolution, if you want to learn to analyze capitalism and how it functions, you're better informed reading a bunch of other texts. There is literally, I would say, not a single authoritarian text where what it presumes to be doing is not done better elsewhere by anarchists or libertarian socialists that have a better understanding of how power functions. And you might notice that's my repeated critique. Authoritarian leftists do not understand how power functions. If they did, they wouldn't use the methods they were using. So I don't ever recommend people read authoritarian leftists. I just really don't think they're going to get anything useful out of it. If anything, they might be deceived in the process. And I think that's one of the things I generally worry about is that authoritarian leftist rhetoric is extremely deceitful, that it lies constantly, that it misrepresents its opponents, whether those opponents are clear, near allies, Lenin constantly critiquing Kautsky, even though he's much closer to Kautsky than a lot of other theorists. Or their constant misrepresentations of anarchism and libertarian socialism broadly. I just don't think you're going to get a whole lot out of it. I think that at most you might be deceived. You might actually be misinformed in the process. I don't think they're going to help you understand how the world works in any significant sense. At best, they may give you a sort of baby leftist introduction to why capitalism bad. And the reason why they even have that good introduction, the only reason why they even contain that kernel of value is because they're just regurgitating Marx, which they unfortunately will probably also distort and misinform you about. If you read Lenin or Stalin or Trotsky about Marx, you will understand Marx worse than if you had just read Marx. Like, you would probably be better off trying to decipher Marx than being misinformed by any of those people. So I absolutely do not recommend you read the authoritarian leftists. I think that you are much more liable to be misinformed or deceived than you are to learn anything useful about the world. At Anarchy India says, "Great work, comrade. Glad you made these. This series is invaluable." By the way, we see many authoritarian leftists and likewise reactionaries talking about how anarchist projects also had some un-anarchist elements. That's just misleading the topic at hand, because the question is whether a state can actually achieve socialism. Or, to be more accurate, whether it can stop itself from preventing socialism. Any authoritarian or statist elements within previous anarchist projects only tell us that we need to be even more careful in the future, but doesn't give any validation to authoritarianism. Funny how authoritarians accuse anarchists of authoritarianism or of supposedly building authoritarian structures. Yeah, so this is one of those many places I'm talking about where they have deceitful rhetoric. A large part of this deceitful rhetoric comes from one of the worst essays written in the history of political theory, which is Engels on Authority. It is an empty polemic, really containing no useful analysis, which was refuted a year before it was ever published by Bakunin. But they have essentially repurposed Engels' mistaken understanding of how authority functions in order to critique any use of violence, any use of repression, of reaction, any use of a structure or organization as being authoritarian. So most of the time when you find that authoritarian leftists are critiquing the quote unquote authoritarian elements of anarchism, they just don't understand what authoritarianism is. They think authoritarianism is when you defend yourself or when you create organized structures. So most of the time when they tell you that they are, that the anarchists have used an authoritarian structure, that's all they're referring to. That's literally all they're referring to. And in the occasions where they're not, for example, I've seen some of them bring up that the CNTFAI had labor camps or forced labor camps, something akin to a gulag. As you say, if their critique is valid, it's only valid insofar as anarchists should look at that example and recognize they probably shouldn't repeat it, right? I think the best example of this is how when the CNTFAI in Spain gained a lot of control, they began burning down churches and persecuting Christian clergy and so on. I think that is atrocious. There's absolutely no defense for that, and that was a terrible mistake by the Spanish anarchists that should never be repeated, and absolutely could be understood as being authoritarian as being a repressive and regrettable. Okay, but here's the thing: authoritarian leftists don't actually care about that. They don't care about that. They're not. When they lobby these criticisms towards anarchism that it is authoritarian, they're not trying to get you to disavow those aspects. They're actually trying to get you to stop disavowing all of the terrible things their states have done. They're trying to get you to realize that because anarchists have made some mistakes and have implemented authoritarian measures at times, that's because it's inevitable, and their states didn't do anything wrong. They should have done all of those things. That's absolutely just the natural course of events, and trying to avoid those terrible genocidal, mass murdering measures is futile, and that anarchists are just fighting against a current they can't win against. So they don't actually care. They're not trying to get you to disavow it. They're trying to get you to avow it. They're trying to get you to defend the mistakes that anarchists have made as being good, because that's what they do with their examples. They sort of mindlessly defend the worst things that their regimes have done. And if you try to push them to, inspect those things, they will vaguely say that they don't defend everything that was done by those states. But if you actually push them into examples, they'll defend almost every single one of those examples. So what they're trying to get you to do is to be less critical. They're trying to get you to be, to more mindlessly accept the violence and repression that their states have carried out by pointing out that anarchists have sometimes made mistakes in implementing these things. So next comment, so as I did in the previous ones, I've included these comments by this user who, I'm just calling RFV because their name is just literally just like keyboard smash of letters. But I felt like I should include numerous of these comments. They made the most nuanced comments, even though I disagree with them. And as I mentioned the last few times, this person's clearly a Trotskyist, but I feel like I should include these. They say, I'm not sure if the first premise of the part synoptic view is still valid. They're referring to, in the video, I talk about James C. Scott's concept of the synoptic view. And I'll get into that here in a second as I kind of engage with this criticism. They say, today we have the internet and vast computing and storage capabilities. With this, the needs of everyone can be analyzed by just letting them place orders and process them. This can then be used to calculate the whole chain of production. Basically what Amazon does, but just for the whole economy. Actually, Allende wanted to implement something like this, but probably in a simpler form, as computers were much less capable in the early 70s. It was called Cybersyn and designed by the Englishman Stafford Beer. It was never implemented because the Allende government was overthrown by fascists before implementation was possible. Cool. So I want to say numerous things about this. First of all, that doesn't really invalidate the synoptic view at all. Basically, what is James C. Scott is talking about with the synoptic view is that as soon as you design any sort of metric to understand a complex system, you are going to reduce that complex system to the metric. Okay, so in capitalism, we see this in the reduction of everything to currency. Right? The commodity. This is what Marx was kind of critiquing with the commodity form. It reduces everything to the commodity form. And in doing so, it sort of empties all of the complexity of society, of its meaning, of its depth. And in doing so, it sort of empties us of our meaning and depth. It turns us into cogs in a machine. And James C. Scott talks about how this is kind of inherent to the state. I would say it's inherent to all hierarchical power structures. That's sort of what I argue in this work and in others. But what they're trying to claim is that this is just not a problem because of computers. Now, what I point out in the comments in my response to this is that it's literally not possible to stop the synoptic view as a hierarchical power structure. Hierarchical power structures always fundamentally reduce context, because when you have something that is pyramidal, it concentrates power more and more and more the further you go up the pyramid. And that means that there's less processing power in that sense. When you feed that information into fewer and fewer agents, and those fewer agents make more and more powerful decisions that change things more and more in society. And so things have to be reduced to more and more simple components such that they can process them, so they can understand and make decisions about them. Now, what they're arguing is that computers can do the job. And computers aren't going to fix the problem. Computers may process things more quickly, and they may be able to think about more metrics at a time. But by choosing a metric, you reduce the complexity of a thing. The universe is not built upon the metric of money. The universe is not built upon the metric of, orders and fulfillments, Amazon is always fundamentally reducing the complexity of the world, insofar as you're using Amazon as an example. Amazon is not thinking about the externalities. Amazon is not thinking about how it affects the ecosystem and how every decision it makes, ripples out into everything else. It can't conceive that. Okay. And I'm not saying that's even, and I want to go further. That's not just because it's authoritarian. That's because no system can truly conceive of that level of complexity that the universe contains. Okay. The only way we can even approximate it is by creating a system wherein those who receive the signals and make decisions are closer to the stimuli. So such that stimuli gets filtered through fewer and fewer layers. Okay. Whereas in an authoritarian system, it must be filtered all the way up to that very narrow bottleneck. Think of it as being a series of bottlenecks, okay, where the information gets reduced and reduced and reduced and reduced the further it goes up the structure. So let's talk a little bit about cybersyn. So interestingly, I talked about this a little bit on live stream last time. I've been researching cybersyn a lot for the upcoming video series. And even though cybersyn had a lot of promise insofar as that Stafford Beer indeed did create something which was quite exceptional and interesting, the state directly sabotaged the implementation of cybersyn, such that Stafford Beer wanted to implement something because what he recognized, complete your sentences, Daniel. Stafford Beer wanted to implement something that was bottom up. And the reason Stafford Beer wanted to implement that was because he recognized that was a system that took in all of those complex signals and was able to make decisions about them in a not even just a quick manner, but in a manner that took into account all of the context on the ground. Okay. And Stafford Beer wanted to implement that. Unfortunately, the state prevented that from taking place, and it inserted a bunch of what were called interventors, which were essentially repurposed managers into all of the workplaces. So I would also like to point out that you're incorrect that it was never implemented. It was in fact implemented. It was implemented in an incomplete fashion, but it was implemented. And it was implemented erroneously as per the plans of Stafford Beer, precisely because the state intervened with its requirements to degrade the complexity of the very system that it was intervening in. It's actually a perfect example of the synoptic view in action. The state enforcing that bottleneck of information, enforcing top-down control when bottom-up control by the person who was conceiving that very structure would have been more efficient, would have been more in line with the thing that he was suggesting. So I just want to say that, in fact, Chile is a great counterexample to what you're saying, not a great example of what you're saying. Next one. Okay, this one's pretty long. Some of these are really long. Louis Victor says, warning, rambling ahead. The bit at the end talking about authoritarians has grown to be something I think we need to triple efforts and attention against. Ever since moving to Finland, one thing became clear to me here, and for sure applies to other places in some capacity. Much more than the more over-the-top authoritarians, usually tankies or tanky-esque, what I see is one of the major obstacles here are the quote-unquote leftists, who are all vastly statists of one variety or another, fully engaged in electoralism and giving voting in the current system far more credit than it deserves, and some downright support some degrees of pseudo-technocracy we have here. They somehow convince themselves this system is leftist, it's on the way to become more and more socialist, when in fact, from the start, it was a project by the neoliberals. This place is underpopulated and frigid most of the year. The only thing they could possibly exploit was a qualified, highly educated workforce that didn't exist. So they made it so that there could be. Collective benefits compared to other systems are a mere lucky coincidence, not what it is for, and are consistently shrinking now that there is a less drastically unfulfilled demand. Wow, those parentheses contained a lot of very interesting information. Let me continue. And I say this because these people have an advantage over most Leninists, is that they can point to these social democracy darlings and declare they work and are good. And of course, these are states with what it entails. They seriously suffocate discourse, making de facto propaganda for the system, helping perpetuate it, and being antagonistic to more anarchic groups, all while being far more palatable and tolerable to everyone else. In my opinion, they are a massive threat because of it. They're stealthy counter-revolutionaries at face value. Of course, if you talk with them, they're openly counter-revolution. All for that vote the change one step at a time. Too fast, too radical change scares people and doesn't work. Bullshit rhetoric, reinforcers, and so on. Unfortunately, this matches what a lot of people have told me in the sort of Scandinavian social democracies, is that people are pretty bought into social democracy. They don't really have much of a radical movement anymore. There is not much of a revolutionary constituency, and it's because social democracy is very, very successful at suppressing revolution. When people believe that their dominators will hand them table scraps, they will largely not want to take place in a protracted revolutionary process. I mean, that's a lot of effort. It's understandable how they would not want to do that. So instead, what they do is they say, wow, I would much rather take place through these easier means, through, just voting every once in a while and just convincing people to vote for the right party and so on, right? Like, it's obvious why that works to suppress revolutionary activity. When people think that there are just easier means to achieve these improvements in social conditions, they will happily take place in them. However, as this person points out, all of these are slowly rolling back, right? So you can see that in all of these Scandinavian social democracies, all of these measures that were once very transformative are slowly being repealed little by little, and right-wing, even sometimes overtly fascist political parties are beginning to gain a sort of preeminence in each of these social democracies in a way which is very disturbing. So unfortunately, what this person is saying appears to be very true and matches the accounts that I have heard from people that are in those countries. What I want to say to anybody who's living in those countries is, as miserable and difficult as it is your job as somebody who has those revolutionary ambitions to begin creating something that, when all of those measures fall apart, when those fascist governments come into place, you will have organizations ready to radicalize the people, ready to provide education, ready to provide a vehicle for radical action. Because unfortunately, that's almost surely what is inevitably going to happen, in which case people are going to be looking for an outlet for more radical and militant impulses. And that's the job of revolutionaries in these very, dire circumstances where like an example like a social democracy, where you might think, those are pretty great circumstances, right? People have welfare programs and so on. It must be a good place to organize radicalism. No. Those are precisely the conditions that have destroyed radicalism in those places. So it's our job to prepare the soil, to plant seeds, knowing we may never sit under the shade of those trees that will grow from them. And I know that's difficult, but it's the work that has to be done, even if it is slow and may seem like it has excruciatingly little outcome. The time will come where inevitable struggle will take place, and what you've created will hopefully be there as a receptacle for that militant struggle. Nicholas Duncan says, haha, nice outro. Love that song. Loved the video. Yeah, see, I don't know how many people actually watched the very end, part 4, but I included that old labor hymn, Whose Side Are You On? Which Pete Seeger, I think, and he intended it to be about, on the side of the workers or the capitalists. And of course, that's exactly how I'm utilizing it there. Are you on the side of the workers or the state capitalists, who are themselves forces of bourgeois reaction? The states in all of these places have served to empower and entrench capitalism. So that old labor hymn applies in all of those places as well. Do you support the workers, or do you support figures like Stalin, Lenin, Trotsky, and Mao, who worked to repress those workers and to destroy the revolutionary activity that they were carrying out? Here we are, RFV again. RFV says, quote unquote, complex ecosystems are destroyed because of capitalist overexploitation, not because the state doesn't tolerate their diversity. No, this is not correct precisely. I mean, it's not exactly because of the state. It's because of hierarchical power. But then they go on to say, if there is a world revolution that leads to a worldwide worker state, which, as I've said before, is impossible. It's not real. There's no reason why the economy can't be transformed to be sustainable, except that it might be too late because the tipping points of climate change might be reached before the socialist revolution occurs. What? Yeah, this is just, once again, it's like an article of religious faith to these people that the state can just do anything. Also, I see no evidence for the claim by Bookchin, which is next point in this video. Most lands used by humans is used for agriculture, which doesn't use an inorganic environment. And this will not change as the world population is still increasing, and there's a limit on how efficient soil can be used. I mean, this is just a blatant lack of understanding of the points of the video. The video went into pretty excruciating detail explaining why that hierarchical power structures reduce complexity. Bookchin, in the quote about inorganic, systems, he's talking about like cities and stuff, right? Like very bizarre misunderstanding. This one of many of the comments they've left is the most incoherent, the least understanding of what was being said, the biggest stretch almost. And that's saying something, because several of these have been a pretty big stretch. I just want to focus in, however, on the first part. Complex ecosystems are destroyed because of capitalist overexploitation. This is absolutely false. And this demonstrates a lack of understanding of history. In fact, environments were being devastated as far back as the feudal era. Some scientists have indicated the beginning of global warming did not begin with the era of industry, but in fact began with the era of over extracting lumber in the old feudal empires, that the clear cutting of forests en masse and then the burning of that wood en masse was actually beginning of the injection of carbon into the atmosphere, which led to warming trends we see now. Of course, can't be said to be as dramatic, as exploitative, as destructive as capitalism. That would be absurd to claim. But the idea that capitalism is just like uniquely over exploitative is absurd and false, just like literally false. It is instead that hierarchical power sees everything as quantized and simplified, as per what we discussed in their previous misunderstanding. And that also applied, of course, to these hierarchical power structures of feudalism. This, in fact, was partially what drove land wars and the prevalence of land wars, was that they wanted more land, therefore they had more trees, therefore could extract more lumber, therefore could burn more of that lumber for fuel, therefore could use more of that lumber to build houses. They were empires that were funded on that lumber extraction. And the more land they had, the more lumber that they could create and therefore use. And so the problem of climate change actually began before the existence of capitalism. And this problem of devastating ecosystems goes back as far as hierarchical power structures have been capable of interacting with ecosystems. They are destructive entities. Hierarchical power is fundamentally anti-ecological. Okay, another comment by RV. It's very close to the beginning of the video. Apparently, they take exception with the fact that they say that assumes that China was created independently from the USSR. I didn't claim that in the video. I think what they're getting at is where I say that the USSR and China differed considerably. And they say this is not true, though, as the USSR gave a lot of military, economic, and ideological aid to China. Yes, they're correct. I say that in the video. And the CCP never was strong in theory, which you see in its many errors and turns, like the Great Leap Forward or the start and end of the Cultural Revolution. It is bizarre to me that they are looking at the Great Leap Forward as the biggest mistake, but I guess I can understand that insofar as it led to a great famine. But they say this theoretical weakness of the CCP. See, this is why I call them idealists. This is why I say that authoritarian leftists are idealists. Okay, is because they believe that the ideology of the ruling class is what determines, the limits on their ability to use state power. Like, it's funny how they're constantly accusing anarchists of being idealists, yet this is actual idealism. They believe that the ideas of the ruling class take precedence over the machinery of how society functions. And that's just absolutely false. That's a misunderstanding of how power functions. Once again, just the eternal refrain of critiquing authoritarian leftists. They don't understand how power functions. Power structures are like machines. Okay? It doesn't matter who you put into the seat of power of that machine. The machine functions in a particular way. It doesn't matter if you get some super enlightened vanguard that knows all the theory, okay? That the degeneration, quote unquote, of the worker state has nothing to do with the ideology of the people who are sitting in the seat of power. It has everything to do with the fact that the seat of power exists, okay? It is not because China wasn't, quote unquote, ideologically advanced. The USSR was like not, quote unquote, ideologically advanced. It doesn't matter. Wouldn't matter how ideologically advanced they were. The machine only functions as per its structure. You cannot take the machine and make it into something that it is not. So it's just, this just blows my mind that they can say these things and call other people idealists. They say this theoretical weakness of the CCP made it easy for the Stalinists to form it in their image. P.S. Similar things are also true for the other states mentioned later in this video, like Yugoslavia, where the KGB killed over a dozen communist leaders to bring Tito to power? Bizarre. They tried to stop Tito from being in power. Or Cuba. Except Venezuela, which has a different problem. They never finished their revolution and didn't fully abolish capitalism. None of these examples abolished capitalism. This is a bizarre thing to say. Like Venezuela specifically, they didn't abolish capitalism. USSR and China, I mean, they did fully. It's hilarious. They have a mixed economy, which works badly, and an unstable situation of dual power, as the remaining capitalists still have a lot of economic power and political influence. Yeah, this is, I think, by far the most nonsensical comment this person ever made on any of these videos. I think it demonstrates their complete lack of understanding of how power structures actually work. It's like mind-blowing that they really think that Venezuela was like unique in its inability to abolish capitalism, as if like the USSR and China abolished capitalism. Not only do they believe that ideas guide power structures, but they also think that the USSR and China abolished capitalism, and Venezuela was somehow radically different. They didn't abolish capitalism. That's their problem. Obviously, they think abolishing capitalism is just when you like destroy the previous bourgeois class through like, Bonapartist, massacres. Just absurd misunderstandings of how any of these structures work and how revolution functions. Hakatana says, I'm going to say this right now. Tankies would have supported the Nazis had they not known about their genocidal regime. They'd have used every excuse in the book, stretched every application of material dialectics to their absolute limits, and denied every atrocity they committed due to using the aesthetics and branding of socialism, despite the fact that they're clearly not. I don't remember if this is one of two comments that makes a comment like this, but I actually disagree. A big reason why Russia took that side. I mean, okay, first of all, they basically did support the Nazis at first. They made non-aggression pacts with the Nazis very early on. However, the Nazis sort of violated those pacts. You can go look it up. It's called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And they did actually make early non-aggression pacts with the Nazis. However, the Nazis were openly anti-communist and anti-Marxist, okay? Like, there was just like no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The Nazis were always talking about how much they hated the Bolsheviks and how much they hated Marxism and how much they hated communists. Their use of this word socialism was so perfunctory, so performative, that I really don't think there is any world where the USSR would have actually cooperated with the Nazis. And that's not to say because I'm trying to like give one to the USSR. I just really think that they were competing geopolitical blocks in that sense. So yeah, I disagree with that, but I understand what you're saying. I get why you might hold that cynicism after the video series that you just watched. Okay, this one's also another long one. At the Void Spaghetti Girl says, "Hi Anark, this was an excellent series. You presented it pedagogically. How can the state be a dead end for actual socialism if we exist as subjects of the state right now, trying to find ways to dismantle the oppressive capitalistic paradigm? We won't be able to progress society outside of a state as the existing states are too big. We need to transform them and defang them incrementally." I mean, I disagree with this person, but we'll continue here. The idea that the workers will spontaneously form power in numbers to usurp capitalism is unrealistic. The masses are mostly lumpenproles and will not be educated into class consciousness by capitalism or the state. Only by incremental, gradual spread of knowledge about socialism will class consciousness achieve the level of common knowledge. This is like a mix. I kind of agree with some of this and disagree with other parts. I agree that it is important to entertain the idea that the state is counter-revolutionary, but it is also important to realize that a successful, lasting revolution is itself, A, not 100% certain to occur. I agree with them. B, not definitively a prerequisite for actual socialism to happen. I disagree with them. And there is nothing inherent about the state that requires it to perpetuate its own power. I absolutely disagree with them. And monopoly of violence over a subjugate nation or people just because previous socialist projects turned out that way. Okay, we'll stop here and respond. It is not because of just previous socialist projects. It is because every state that has ever existed has demonstrated this fact. Every power structure, whether horizontal or hierarchical, seeks to perpetuate itself. That is a fundamental nature of power structures. If they did not seek to perpetuate themselves, they would not be able to exist. In order for a thing to exist, it must create and maintain aspects about itself, which create its ability to perpetuate into the future. If it does not have those basic capacities, it will not exist. It will explode. It will degrade. It will fall apart. It will die. It will not get chosen as selection filters come through. Okay. And states are no different. In fact, states are massive apparatuses of self-perpetuation. They might be understood primarily as apparatuses for self-perpetuation. There is no way to construct a hierarchical power structure which does not seek to self-perpetuate itself. It would cease to even be a hierarchical power structure in the process. And the thing here about its monopoly of violence over a subjugate nation or people, that's just part of the definition of a state. The state is control over a few different components. And those are, things like financial regulation, regulation writ large, the ability to create laws, the ability to do violence, the ability to, make big moving decisions about how the state, about how, that country or that nationality functions. These are fundamental components of the state. There's no way to have a state that does not have these fundamental components. If it didn't, it really wouldn't even be a state. So I disagree enormously. Like, I think your base premise is just completely wrong. They say we can easily posit a situation where the state has been incrementally transformed via electoralism. I disagree. That's not possible. There's no examples of that because it can't happen. They say through petitioning and protest to a point where the state decides to dismantle itself. Yeah, no, that's literally impossible. It would cease to be a state if that happened. Or even to a point where the state finds itself being, quote unquote, automatically, gradually dismantled purely on the base of its own anti-authoritarian mechanics. If it had anti-authoritarian mechanics, it wouldn't be a state, and it would never allow anti-authoritarian mechanics precisely because it would undermine its ability to self-perpetuate, and all of the agents that control that state would be therefore undermining their own power. And that's just not how power functions. Power does not function to dismantle itself. Power always functions to perpetuate itself. Let's see, where is it? I would also find it as easy to imagine a scenario where a ruling monarch with penultimate power goes, okay, you know what? Fuck this absolute power bullshit, and then proceeding to completely dismantle the royal leadership and retract all the influence it previously had over the subjugate nation. There's a reason that's never happened, and because it's not easy to imagine that scenario. It's easy to imagine it. It's just not easy for it to happen. In fact, it's literally impossible for it to happen. There's a reason why it never did happen. Because that's just, once again, not how power structures function. Power structures function to perpetuate themselves. If you had some king that wanted to dismantle the power structure, competitors within the power structure would probably just usurp the king and then take over the power structure. That king does not have more power than the structure. There's no structure wherein there's a figure within the structure that has more power than the structure. The power structure is what drives the mechanics of society. People within the structures are not the movers and shakers of the structure. The structure is more an effect on the people than the people are an effect on the structure. This is why electoralism does not work. Structures condition the people that are within them. And that is even more true of hierarchical power, which not only attracts the corrupted to begin with, but also corrupts the people that it attracts. They say the state can absolutely be a transitory system, but when it comes to tankies, they're still trying to justify those actors which co-opt the imagery of socialism. Yeah, so this person has failed to understand the thesis of the video. Not trying to go in on them, but they have a very common delusion, I'll call it, a very common misunderstanding about how power functions. Power structures don't undermine themselves. If they do, they are a failed power structure, and they were not built in a way which should have allowed them to exist to begin with. You cannot construct a hierarchical power structure that will seek to undermine itself. The very nature of a hierarchical power structure is that it seeks to perpetuate its hierarchical nature. This person, at Tarek Hunkir, says, I found this video in my recommendation. Horrible video. He thinks that communism is entirely synonymous with the principles of self-government, governance, direct democracy, and decentralization without even addressing criticisms of that conception. That's not exactly what I say here. I guess I could see how you'd have that misunderstanding, but no. A previous commenter actually defined what communism is, which indeed I would say does sort of encompass this concept of self-governance, and does sort of naturally entail decentralization. But as far as direct democracy, I think there's quite a bit of dispute over what the actual form of decision-making might be under communism. This video doesn't really lay out any of those. If anything, it might suggest those just because once once you've seen the abject failure of authoritarianism in the state to actually carry out communism, you of course might naturally conclude that those things are the way that you would achieve it, but it's not like the video says any of those explicitly. And the addressing the criticisms of those is therefore sort of unimportant, because that's not really what the video is talking about. I mean, once again, those may be implications, but if you draw those implications, it's only because you understood the critiques of the things as they currently stand. And they go, I fucking love how the title is a play off of left-wing communism and infantile disorder, because you just know this ultra was triggered by that pamphlet. The language he uses makes you just know that he completely despises ML with every fiber of his being. It's funny to listen to. He uses loaded language at every possible opportunity. Damn. I love that, this person, wow, they're clearly extremely angry, but I think it's very funny that they're talking about me being triggered given this comment. I mean, this is the most thin-skinned comment. I included this here mostly just to laugh at. This person is absurd. Like, clearly they feel very threatened, right? This video was threatening for them. And that's probably because it was meant to threaten their ideology. They probably watched it. It made them feel uncertain. And then they just assumed there must be some like valid criticism of this. And that because I had made them feel threatened, I was just categorically incorrect. But they didn't really present a single counter argument here. And that's because they didn't really engage with any of the arguments of the video. Oh, here's another one. They follow up. Holy fuck, I just saw the part 4. Not gonna lie, I might pick up a pen for the first time to make an anti-anarch. People do be making 4 parts about something instead of reading how it was already responded to 100 times. Imagine thinking you're the first to come up with any argument in such basic politics. I remember I respond to this one. I was like, I invite you to write a response to this piece. So far, authoritarians have just got real angry and not really written anything substantive and not really engaged with anything that was spoken about in this video. And that continues to be the case. Not a shocker, of course, they didn't ever write this piece that they were suggesting. And that's because there really are not substantive responses to things in this video. RFV is kind of an example. You want to see somebody who tried their very best to give substantive responses. These responses by RFV are probably the best you're going to find. And I think as we inspected over the course of these last few videos, they were really not very substantive. They didn't engage with the actual material itself insofar as they didn't understand the arguments at their basic point. They sort of just denied the arguments. So I don't think this person would have done any better. They certainly were not responding in a calm, level-headed sense. This person was clearly just upset and looking for an opportunity to regurgitate orthodoxy. This person's kind of repeating something RFV said. Little weasel is what they are, is what they say. China and the USSR aren't very different ideologically, though. Maoism is a variant of Marxist-Leninism, Stalinism. Variants of Stalinism are extremely similar. Yeah, I mean, I guess I see what you're saying there. But kind of as I was pointing out, they had large divergences in their approach and their conception of revolutionary constituencies. And the video pretty well lays out those differences, or rather, parts 2 and 3 pretty well lay out those differences, especially part 3. I think I just explicitly lay out how Mao's conception of a revolutionary constituency, the revolutionary potential of the peasantry, differed from the sort of Marxist orthodoxy that was practiced in the USSR and perhaps even by Marx himself, although there's some dispute over that. But yeah, I mean, I at least understand what you're saying here. Okay, so here's a long one. They say, it's not counter-revolutionary or anti-socialist to claim that capitalism is better at growth than socialism, or that growth can be necessary for a territory to defend itself from bourgeois pressures. I mean, they just say that, but it absolutely is anti-socialist to claim that capitalism is better at growth than socialism. I mean, like, you are literally just claiming that capitalism is a superior economic system and that socialism will always lose to capitalism. Like, that is the implication of claiming that capitalism is better at growth than socialism. You're saying that the bourgeois, that the capitalist class, is better at administering society than the workers would be. I mean, like, there's no way to interpret that in a way that is not anti-socialist. That is, so many people have tried to refute this point, but it is impossible to refute this point by claiming that you think you need to do capitalism in order to have socialism. You are essentially conceding to the claims of the capitalists that capitalism is more efficient than socialism, that capitalism is better at development and progress than socialism. I don't agree. I think socialism is a superior system for managing society. And there are a variety of ways that you can understand and argue for that. And one of them is going back to that synoptic view that was discussed. There are systems that manage complexity better. It's the reason why Stafford Beer wanted CyberSyn to be bottom up. It's also the reason why cooperatives do better than traditional capitalist firms. They're actually more productive. No, it is absolutely anti-socialist to claim that capitalism is a superior economic system to socialism. Like, there's no way around this. And if you believe that that's necessary for a territory to defend itself from bourgeois pressures, you are conceding capitalism is a superior economic system, and that we're only trying to progress through capitalism to have an inferior economic system, and that's just absurd. It doesn't make any sense. They say, furthermore, even assuming every state requires a further revolution to topple, it can still be easier to topple a state post-MLM revolution than a pre-revolution. No, that does not appear to be the case at all. In fact, it appears to be the case that state capitalism is a little harder to topple than feudalism. We have very few examples of a revolution successfully overthrowing state capitalism, and we have lots of examples of feudal societies being overthrown. So, in fact, when you put state capitalism into place, you may very well be putting into place something that has a much stronger holding pressure to revolutionary activity than the feudal state that existed beforehand. They say, thus, a state, even when requiring a revolution to destroy, can be the path of least resistance to communism, making it non-counter-revolutionary. I mean, this is some real mental gymnastics. Like, you have to create a structure that represses you in hope that it will be easier to destroy, instead of just creating the structure that represents you. They say, for example, when I look at Vietnam, I see a state that, despite its rough history, seems to be less repressive toward anarchists and its population in general than most, if not all, bourgeois states. I don't know why you think that. Vietnam is very repressive towards its anarchists. It's extremely repressive toward anarchists. In fact, numerous Vietnamese anarchists talk about how extensive the repression is. No, this is just absolutely false. In fact, we can look at other examples of state capitalism and see that they're always very actively countervailing the anarchist presence within their society. That being said, they may be less repressive in a general sense towards other citizens because many of those other citizens are not as much of a threat as anarchists. Now imagining a Marxist-Leninist revolution happening in a bourgeois country, that's never happened and never will, because Marxist-Leninism is an ideology of transition from feudalism to capitalism. Marxist-Leninism has no examples of transition out of bourgeois society. With a comparatively privileged history and decades or centuries of Enlightenment values and some form of democracy already under its belt, I can't help but imagine a state that would be considerably less repressive toward anarchism than its predecessor, and thus preferable to it. Yeah, I mean, it's just false. Absolutely false. It's a false assumption. Number one, Marxist-Leninism will never move you out of capitalism. It is literally an ideology built to move you from feudalism to capitalism. It's all it's ever done, and that's because it is modeled on Bonapartism, which was a capitalist or a bourgeois revolutionary method. And so that's all it can do. It can only move you to capitalism. It is the method of moving from feudalism to capitalism. and it will never move you out of capitalism. It's just impossible. You can't use Marxist-Leninism to move out of capitalism. And yeah, that's why we see that Marxist-Leninist states, authoritarian left state capitalism, has been highly repressive to anarchists. Highly, highly repressive. While I would prefer an anarchist revolution where I'm at, and I generally apply anarchist practice, I wouldn't rule out Marxist-Leninism, Maoism from playing and already having played a part in reaching communism. Yeah, this is just contrary to all evidence. In most countries on the imperial periphery, state socialism is way more likely than anarchy at the moment. Once again, the video series shows there is no such thing as state socialism. And every bit of denied imperialist exploitation actually weakens capitalism in the imperial core. I mean, that much is kind of like trivially true. Obviously, if you disallow the imperialists from exploiting people, then that weakens them. So why not welcome such developments? I mean, yeah, I welcome my enemies competing against each other, obviously. Strategically speaking, I see the appeal of condemning really existing socialist states, especially within the imperial core. But conversely, I also see the utility in countering the totally one-sided and exaggerated propaganda most people have been fed, and generally maintaining left unity to more effectively shift the Overton window to the left. I mean, I will say there's no reason for you to perpetuate propaganda, false propaganda about these states. There's no reason to perpetuate lies about Venezuela or Cuba or China. You don't need to lie. I mean, they just are state capitalists. Just say the truth. And the truth is that they're just more capitalist nations. There's no, you don't, and so I would agree. You don't spread like propaganda, false propaganda about these places, and absolutely push back on it where it exists. But you don't need propaganda to push back on any of these places. And there's no reason to take sides. You know, this person, it's clear this person is an anarchist who's surrounded by authoritarian leftists, and they have sort of given in to a campist mentality. And this is often the way that anarchists get converted to authoritarian leftism, is the authoritarians convince them that it is more practical to support state capitalism and to help them spread state capitalism, thinking that it will, as this person says here, create left unity and shift the Overton window left. And it does no such thing. And the reason it does no such thing is because authoritarian leftists are not an important force in any place where their bourgeois transition was not carried out by Marxist-Leninism. The only places where Marxist-Leninism has any significance is in places where their bourgeois revolution was Marxist-Leninist. So everywhere else, Marxist-Leninists are unfortunately kind of a burden. They kind of just hurt our ability to create a broader leftist constituency. And people who are sort of obsessed with left unity are obsessed with appealing to a microsect within the left instead of trying to appeal to the masses who are deathly afraid of state capitalism, who absolutely do not want the state to control everything. They're terrified of it. Talk to any normal person. So I disagree. I just disagree with this whole comment, and I understand why they think this. It's an extremely common mistake to make by anarchists, but it is a mistake that will not only lead us to failure and has absolutely no track record of success, but may lead you to being de-radicalized and to supporting counter-revolution. No offense intended to you as a person. I'm sure you're delightful. Next, this person, I included this one because several people had this misunderstanding. I think it's because they maybe didn't watch the whole series, but this person says, Maximilian says, you can't critique a Marxist definition of the state by using and eventually criticizing the Weber definition of the state as if that is what socialists mean by a transitory state, a la the dictatorship of the proletariat. So I respond to them, and I'll just kind of say it for posterity here. I'm not critiquing the Marxist definition of the state in these videos. That's really not what these videos are about. These videos are about presenting the anarchist definition of the state, applying it to material conditions, and demonstrating that the anarchist conception is the one that produced predictions and a rigorous analysis that understood the circumstances at hand well before they ever came into existence. So this is really not a critique of the Marxist definition of the state that is very vaguely even motioned at in the first part of the series. I'm not concerned with having a debate about the definition of the state. I simply state what the definition of the state is in anarchist understanding in part one, and we move forward with that understanding. We don't spend our time disputing that. Captain Waffles says, people want a strong, centralized state that is going to alleviate the woes of capitalism with socialism, with production based on human need instead of private profits. We need a government of action to fight for working families. It's funny, this person responds like twice, and somebody kind of points out this person is clearly like is obsessed with like Caleb Maupin, and they don't deny it. This person is essentially a Maupinite, you might say. And as I said in a previous comment, this is just absolutely false. In fact, the most pervasive understanding of socialism is that the state controls everything, and people are deathly afraid of that. The vast majority of the populace is horrified of the state having control over everything, to the degree where they're even horrified of welfare programs that would be beneficial to them. You know, like socialized healthcare would be great, but they are so terrified of a strong centralized state that they don't even want it. So this person could not be further from the truth. In fact, it is an impediment to even creating social safety nets, because people are that afraid of a strong centralized state. There's so little demand for one. That they are terrified of even being benefited by one. So this is just the delusion of the authoritarian left. It's part of the reason why I say that they're kind of a burden in conveying a socialist vision to people, is because they falsely think people want their authoritarianism. They falsely think people want their despotic regimes, and they're wrong. They're wrong. That's just not true. This person, Candahome, says, recognize sacrifice, distill and simplify. Oh, I mean, this is as close as you're getting. I I may be willing in like my Anark Abridged videos, you could kind of find that, but distilling and simplifying is overrated in my opinion. I think that people need complexity. I think we've got enough of distilling and simplifying. I think if somebody else wants to distill and simplify the state is counter-revolutionary, go for it. But this channel is focused on developing in-depth descriptions, trying to understand theory and history as it is. That being said, it's a worthy task. It's a worthy task. When I say it's overrated, I don't mean that it's not worth doing. I just mean that I think there have been enough people doing that. We've got a lot of people doing distilling and simplifying, not enough people that are doing the in-depth stuff. Personally, I don't think I'll be spending any time trying to create a distilled and simplified version of the state as counter-revolutionary. Creating the long version was a lot of effort. Creating the short version is often more difficult. Creating things that are short and simplified and maintaining the level of depth and complexity can be very, very challenging. Okay, so... Oh, wrong one. Okay, so this person's Ollie Mendez says, I legit don't get MLs. They use phrases like dialectical materialism to claim they're just being realistic, not like those idealistic anarchists. But what's realistic about assuming giving power to a few people will help the many, even if it's supposed to be temporary? Who gets to choose when the time to go to real communism is right? Do they think their little vanguard party will give up power when the people decide they want to move to a stateless society? That's not realistic. unless they think we'll just have another revolution, in which case, why not cut out the middleman? I mean, just as a hypothetical, could you imagine if a government claimed that to be communist kept slipping, of a government that claimed to be communist kept slipping further and further back into neoliberalism under the guise of just being realistic, when really they were just finding ways to maintain their own power? I guess what I'm saying is Marxist-Leninists are liberals, but with more violence. Yeah, I mean, I have very little to add to this because you pretty much just nailed it. Like, the last part, I would say I generally don't call them liberals because there's just too much. That word just gets slung around too much in leftist spaces. So I don't usually call them liberals, but what I do call them is militant social democrats, because that's kind of what I see them as. They're social democrats, but they're willing to do an extreme amount of violence and repression in order to get social democracy. And honestly, that's being generous, because most of the time they don't even get social democracy. They just get regular old capitalism, and not even always with a lot of welfare programs. I mean, like, look at China. It doesn't even have a universal healthcare system. You know, it has a private healthcare system. So it's like, you don't even get robust social democracy a lot of the time. It seems like you actually get better chance at social democracy through electoralism. So yeah, I agree with the rest of this. It's not realistic. They like to present themselves as the realistic thinkers, but in reality, they're not. Their method doesn't work. They are failed scientists. They claim to be scientific thinkers, but they have essentially denied evidence. They've denied the outcome of experiment and have doubled down on a method that only produces capitalism. And they just claim that one day it will magically transform into something other than capitalism. Mr. Frog number 3 says, Anark Hakim debate. Yes, please. I'd consider it, but I don't know. I'd under certain circumstances, I'd consider it, but Hakim strikes me as kind of being disingenuous. Like, the sorts of points they make demonstrate they don't have a fundamental knowledge of anarchism, that they basically just believe a bunch of kind of shallow mischaracterizations, that they have basically the same amount of knowledge about anarchism as just a regular liberal might. And so that means they probably wouldn't be a very good debate partner. I'd probably spend the whole time educating them, and that wouldn't make a very good debate. Okay, next one we've got here. They say, William De Silva says, I as an MLM view you as an ally. We have the same goals. I want to avoid mistakes of the past, but how can I buy into an anarchist plan when I've not seen a historic example which actually diminished hierarchy to the degree that the USSR, North Korea, Cuba, China has? I mean, first of all, that's just false. None of those diminished hierarchy. That's such a bizarre thing to say. All of those enforced a new hierarchical power structure. Anarchists have a much better track record of reducing hierarchical power. You can look at, the CNTFAI or the Free Territories. Both of those saw vast reductions in hierarchical power. Whereas all the examples you just gave were very, very hierarchical structures. You might argue they diminished hierarchy because they transitioned out of feudalism. But if that's if that's your condition, if that's your circumstance, or if that's your requirement, then you think capitalism reduces hierarchy. And that's really not a good understanding of what's happening here. It's part of the reason why we aren't allies, unfortunately. They continue, I would rather go for the safe historical bet whose revolutions which have reduced hierarchy in the past, which, as we just said, they've not. Also, I don't think socialism is weak. I just understand that integration with the capitalist class is bloody. They will hoard their wealth like dragons. Also, seems like you want Soviets. It seems like we need to be building worker strength regardless. Very odd. Some of this is odd. The part, they don't think socialism is weak. They understand the integration of the capitalist class is bloody, but that's what you're suggesting is integration with the capitalist class. So not sure what's happening there. They will hoard their wealth like dragons. I mean, sure, unless you nationalize it, in which case you just still have capitalism. I don't know. Clearly, we have a very different understanding of what's happening here. Also, seems like you want Soviets. Yeah, the actual Soviets, like at the beginning of the USSR. If you watch part 2, you can tell that that's what I'm suggesting. But that's not what the Soviets were. Like, you know, the propaganda suggests it, but that's not actually what the Soviets were. They were not bottom up. They were top down forms of control. This person, Lena ML, says, socialism isn't dictated by worker self-management or autonomy or what else. That's a useless metric. Worker self-management is the goal of the left. If you don't support worker self-management, you're not really even a leftist. Like that's the base requirement to even be on the left is support of worker management. So if you think that's a useless metric, you're not a leftist. They say, I could easily say that the representation of workers by a political organization can be a form of worker democracy. Yeah, that would be a normal claim because that would be the leftist perspective on it. They say, even if you refuse to acknowledge it as such, yeah, that's the center of the critique. That's the center of the critique. Representation is a liberal idea. Worker management must be direct. But that would be a much better tack than saying that it's a useless metric. Saying it's a useless metric is essentially being not a leftist. They say, I don't believe that socialism is weak. Capitalism would be weak if it didn't use means of force and suppression to preserve itself, just like how a worker-owned firm would be weak without some protection by a political entity of sorts. Once again, the common misunderstanding that anarchists don't suggest defending ourselves. They say you're advocating for a socialism that is pure and exists independently of any phenomena we've seen in human history. No, absolutely false. In fact, it's been implemented and was highly effective when it was implemented. They say we haven't seen the state completely and totally abolished. That's incorrect. I mean, we've had quite a few examples of the state being abolished. Anarchists have already done this, and they have implemented the sort of socialism I'm suggesting, especially without the help of other revolutionary movements that gave the political instability necessary for anarchists to thrive, as seen in Russia and Catalonia. Anarchists were part of that process in both occasions. Are they just what are they even suggesting here? This is very unusual. Are they suggesting that the anarchists just capitalized on the fascist coup? I mean, that is kind of like trivially correct, but why would that be bad? Like the Bolsheviks didn't cause the Russian Revolution. The workers did. Like the Bolsheviks just capitalized on a workers' revolution. The Bolsheviks didn't lead the workers' revolution. That's not what happened. One thing you notice in all these comments is that authoritarians don't actually understand what happened in any of these occasions. All they've read is sort of like these gushing hagiographies, these false retellings of history by people like Grover Furr and Michael Parenti and these other people that are just distorting history. They're just retelling Bolshevik propaganda. So what this leads to is they just actually don't understand what happened in history. And then they falsely derive all kinds of conclusions about what has and has not happened, and therefore what has and has not been successful. You know, this person like falsely thinks anarchists have never put into implementation their plans. They falsely apparently think that the anarchists were just opportunistically jumping on the back of revolutions, and I guess the Bolsheviks weren't. Like, it's hard to combat ignorance, is one thing you'll notice. And this is like weaponized ignorance. You know, the authoritarian left misinforms its own ranks. And so before you can even talk to them about how reality works, first you have to like debunk the false conceptions that they've already been taught, which is exhausting, right? Like you might notice that's just the recurring theme with so many of these comments here. It's just that first, I have to like literally just say, no, that's false. Like that's where we have to start from. And unfortunately, I found that happens in a lot of these debates. Sometimes when, you know, it's a back and forth, and I've had these on like Twitter or something, you know, I'll have to go and I'll have to like cite all of these examples. I'll have to like tell them the dates and months that things happened. And by the end, they'll still just deny it because they value the false narrative more than they value any sort of recounting of the real history that took place. That was a big reason why I created this series. But this person clearly still does not understand what the conditions of these things were. They say socialism is above all else a constantly changing process and experiment, not a permanent state of affairs. See, I would say this is opportunism at its finest. And I'm not really, I hope everybody understands, I'm not really attacking this person. This person is just misinformed. If you think socialism is just whatever and is this constantly changing state of affairs, and communism is just this constantly changing state of affairs, how do you discern whether something is or is not socialist? Is or is not communist? If a fascist government calls itself socialist and says that one day it will transition to communism, does that mean that it is socialist? Does that mean it is communist? Is all that is required in your mind for something to be socialist or communist to simply claim the mantle? To claim that one day in a far future, they will lead you to this state of existence? Because for me, what is required is the actual mechanical orientation of society toward particular ends. Okay? The actual construction of real material things that lead to particular outcomes. It's not good enough for me for people to just say they hold a particular ideology. It's not okay for my rulers to simply claim they're socialists and to continue ruling me however they please. Okay, I need actual material structures to embody this mode of existence. This is why I say that the authoritarian left aren't materialists by their own understanding. They are idealists. They do believe that ideology and claims of movement towards certain things, that drivers at the seat of the machine are what drive the machine and not the material structure of the machine. And this is a perfect example. And it leads to opportunism. It leads to things like the Bolshevik counter-revolution. So here, this person says, Afgor says, anarchists criticize Marxism instead of what they imagine Marxism to be. Challenge impossible. There's not a single critique of the state here Marxists don't share. The issue anarchists have is creating a model of revolution that works, or isn't just a state in all but name. You start at state bad and work your way back from there and end up wrong on thousands of issues because of it. It's also incredibly dishonest to call Putin simping fascists communists, to call Putin simping fascists communists just because they call themselves communist. You're doing the exact thing you incorrectly claim communists do, putting aesthetics above an objective analysis. Very odd comment. Especially given that, once again, as I kind of said in an earlier comment, this isn't really about criticizing Marxists. It's about criticizing like Lenin and Stalin and all of them. I don't really consider them Marxists. I consider them at best co-opting Marx. I understand Marx. I was sort of a baby leftist who was like engaged with Marx, you know, like Marx was like the main theorist who drove my mind when I was first becoming radicalized. And in the process, I read a lot of Marx and spent a lot of my time trying to understand Marx. So I'm not really criticizing Marx here. And this criticism, I think the reason I even included this one, because it might seem repetitive, this is even here, is they say, the issue anarchists have is creating a model revolution that works. As I've stated, false. Anarchists and libertarian socialists are the only ones that have any model of revolution that actually works because they've made any progress whatsoever toward the goal. But it's the second part. Or isn't just a state in all but name. See, this is the funny little hedge they do. The funny little hedge they do is that if anarchists succeed in their mind, that's because what they did was a state. But in saying that, what they are admitting is two things. They're admitting they don't understand what the anarchists consider a state to begin with. And number two, they're basically admitting that anarchists are doing the practical things that they suppose are necessary. And these are sort of contradictory notions. They're claiming the anarchists aren't successful, and yet you're saying they created a state, and you're saying a state is necessary. So are anarchists creating a state, which you say is necessary, and that's why they're succeeding? Or are they not creating a state because they don't know what a state is? Like, it's a nonsensical critique. It reveals that they don't understand what the state is. They don't understand what the anarchist critique of the state is. And that they're disingenuously claiming that the anarchist projects aren't succeeding, but at the same time they are succeeding by use of a state. This is annoying to me because it is so clearly just layers of obfuscation, layers of deception. I don't know if when they say these things, they're like aware of the deception that they're doing, but it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. The anarchists aren't creating a state. The anarchist definition of a state is not just when you have the ability to do violence and defend yourself, or when you have organization and structure and can make decisions. Okay? It actually really is embodied in historical meaning of the state. It's not this idealist conception of the state where the state is just anybody that defends a class, which is both nonsensical, ahistoric, and has no examples of a worker state in that sense. The anarchists are creating bodies for self-defense and decision-making. And in fact, yes, that is highly effective because that is absolutely necessary. And that's what anarchists have always advocated. You just don't understand that because you don't understand anarchist theory. So they look at the CNTFAI and they say it's a state. See, the anarchists contradict themselves. No, the CNTFAI is exactly what anarchists have been advocating since the beginning. Just frustrating because they just display their ignorance of anarchism and their ignorance of history so clearly. And it's like, I'm not even angry at you. I'm angry at whoever misinformed you. You know, like that's the thing about this for me. They said this person, MJ Anti-Imperialist Party says, read Lenin. I did. You should go watch part 2 because I just basically, I'm quoting Lenin and I'm saying why Lenin is wrong. I mean, I read Lenin and I'm sorry to tell you, he was wrong about almost everything he said. Lenin was a bourgeois opportunist. He was basically just another social democratic politician who co-opted a revolution and aided in the recuperation of socialism. And I think that he was probably one of the most harmful figures in modern history and was probably one of the most effective counter-revolutionaries to ever live because he helped recuperate socialism into being capitalism. And to this day now, we have people who are deluded about what socialism and communism are. And it was in a large part due to the deception of Lenin and Lenin's opportunism and his sort of cynical politicking and redefinition of words and his distortions of Marx. So yeah, I read Lenin and that's why I don't like him. We have Captain Waffles again. This is the Moppanite. He says, the amount of mental gymnastics one has to do to completely discard all actually existing socialist states or even non-socialist but strong state-centered economies like Iran and Russia. Oh my God. They just admit it. Wow. To come to this conclusion that states are all bad all the time is fucking baffling. I was in anarchism for about a year. That shit stopped when I started reading about the economic and material well-being brought to billions of people through socialist states. It's like, damn, wait until you find out about like Sweden and Norway and Denmark, and Iceland. It's going to blow your mind. Oh man. It also stopped when I really dug into the history of the U.S. state. If you ever need a reality check on whether or not all states are bad, just compare the U.S. with any socialist state and you'll quickly see who the real bad guys are. Not states, but capitalists who in the U.S. also control the state. Sorry to tell you, buddy, but they control the state in all the places you're talking about as well because all the places you're talking about are capitalist. Yeah, I mean, this is Campist brainworms, right? And it's just a repetition of these people who think you have to like take sides. like you have to side between one oppressor or the other. They don't support the workers. They just think that you're choosing between states. And instead of actually fighting for worker control or the elimination of capitalism, they just want kinder capitalism. Elwood Gaming. See, I don't know. This is kind of getting repetitious at this point. I might skip through these if they keep repeating the exact same things. This person says, anarchist just never going happen. We need the state. Without it, who going to protect us from other state? Like I said earlier, this is just the fundamental mythology of the state. They don't defend you because they are trying to actually defend you from aggressors. They are defending you so they can continue exploiting you. So it seems to me that if we want to stop being exploited, we need to figure out how to create structures wherein we can defend ourselves without the need of an exploiter to prevent other exploiters from exploiting us. I think we need to create a way for us not to just be hosts being competed over by different exploiters. And here's the last one. I remember I included this because just, it's just so juicy. And they say, okay, Ultra. That's it. I guess I'll just see myself off. I accidentally grabbed the wrong frame here. Okay, Ultra. They're talking about being an ultra leftist, which I think is funny because when these people say ultra leftist, they really are just talking about being a leftist. And this goes all the way back to Lenin. It might even precede Lenin, but ultra leftist just means you're a socialist or a communist and you're not a co-opter who tries to redefine all of these words in order to declare success. So that's the end of the comments. And damn, this was a long one. I'm getting pretty exhausted here, so I'm not going to belabor the point here at the end. But this one was an opportunity for me to ramble about my annoyance with authoritarian leftists. I hope you enjoyed it because, damn, 2 hours and 15 minutes of that. I hope you enjoyed it. Otherwise, that was just a lot to sit through. In any occasion, if you like the video, click like, leave a comment because it helps with the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel if you've been watching numerous videos here and you still haven't subscribed. You should subscribe. I mean, this is just what the channel is all about. You're going to get more content like this, going to pop up in your subscription feed, and you're not going to have to go find it on the homepage, blah, blah, blah. If you want to support the channel as well, and you already watch the channel, just understand that the most important thing to support the channel is actually when you see a thumbnail for the video pop up, click that thumbnail and then watch the video. And the longer you watch the video after clicking a thumbnail when it pops up, that helps it in the algorithm. And this is one of the biggest things that can help it in the algorithm. Lastly, if you really, really support the channel and you appreciate the work that I'm doing here, you should go over to my Patreon at patreon.com/anark, ANARK, and pledge any amount. We got like $2, $5, $7, $20. I don't know. Different tiers. Okay. You choose the one that you can afford and please help out the channel. Can't even explain to you how much it helps. As my patrons have grown, that's why you're seeing things like this. This is why you're seeing 2 hour and 15-minute Anark Responds videos. This is why you saw a 5-hour live stream the other day, because I'm actually starting to slowly be able to support myself on the channel. So if you want to make a big difference in my life, you want to see me continue producing more content, if you want to help me keep making these video essays, go become a patron. And that's it. I think that's it. That's it. Okay. Next week, I'll probably move on to another Anark Responds, and who knows which one it's going to be. Why don't you comment below and you tell me which video essay you think I should look at the comments to next. Anyway, that's it, everybody. I will see you next time.